Hi, my name is Andrew McLaren. Today we're going to talk about SEP number 3 in the Next Generation Science Standards. This is the practice that's all around designing and conducting an investigation. And I wanted to help you make an assessment for this because we oftentimes do this skill in class, but we don't really assess it. And I made this with ChatGPT. So this video is going to have a couple different sections where I show you stuff that I've done from years ago around this practice, like in the class trying to support students, but they're not really assessments. And I want to show you how this is assessed on the state test, because that's kind of like what we're aiming for, or one way to measure this, but it gets kind of murky, and I want to talk about why. And then also, I'll show you how I use ChatGPT to make my current rubric, as well as my process of trying to make a rubric, just kind of brainstorming collaboratively with that. And then there will be a section where we actually talk about this rubric and handout. If you want to skip straight to that, go ahead. There will be in the timeline sections split up so you can find that and just skip to that part of the video. And then also I want to show you chat actually trying to do this practice with this type of structure or idea. It's kind of cool. So in my previous attempts to teach this skill, I've provided some scaffolding, but I haven't really done a great job of assessing it. So I'm going to show a couple different examples of specifically the design, the investigation, and conduct is, it kind of blurs into SCPs like 4 and 5, but you can see right here I'm having them write a procedure, and there's some general expectations, but it's not very clear. It doesn't tell them particularly what to include. It just says, hey, write this procedure, include some stuff about these materials. Very low bar, typical lab handout kind of thing. This one's a little bit better. I've gotten this from some colleagues around making sure the students can identify the IV and DV, or the independent and dependent variables, as well as constants. That's a really big thing on the state tests, which we'll see soon. And a couple like criteria for success for writing this procedure. I got this from, I think this is from Ben Muir, pretty sure. This type of stuff he and I worked on a fair amount. And then I did some data analysis stuff. This is way beyond the actual practice that we're talking about right now. This type of skills, although some people will put that in designing an investigation, it really is like analyzing data and doing mathematical thinking, like the calculations. And so I don't include that in this particular rubric. Same with the conclusion, like the CER piece right here, that goes more with our practices like 6, 7, and 8. So I'm not really assessing that currently when I'm looking at this one practice. I also had some slides that I really liked here. This just kind of was helping kids understand the independent, dependent variable and like constants and that kind of stuff. But again, this isn't an assessment. This is just like something you'd use to support students getting better at this. And then I really liked this one activity that was an assessment. It's designed particularly around not designing this, but conducting the investigation. So the students are supposed to be like collecting observations, and there needs to be that skill of collecting observations is essentially the main focus. But when I originally designed this, I did a lot around like data collection and analyzing it. And again, like the points, this was just like a bundle of points. It's just like do the assignment, you get the points. So I wasn't giving any good feedback on this particular skill, even though it was kind of emphasized. It just wasn't really done in a great way. And then there's this one thing that I did called the to thin and not to thin experiment, which I'm gonna have a whole video on, where it's basically a long project where different groups, they measured different aspects of some radishes that were being grown that might be like their height or their weight or even just pictures of them, but they need to be doing that in groups, and different groups were measuring different things, and then we were comparing all of our measurements at the very end to see what the effect of thinning radishes was. So this was pretty scaffolded in terms of like giving them this hypothesis and like the general idea of what this could look like with data collection, but each person's data collection was a little bit different. And I believe it's kind of weird that this one is giving them the procedure. I thought I had one that they had to fill it in. No, this is the procedure for planting and thinning. but they had to actually do their own procedure, I believe. So yeah, I ended up having the students on that paper just do their procedure below the other procedures that were given. And then you can kind of see that this is examples of some of the student data that we got. There was like average weight and height. And so different groups had slightly different graphs. And it was really kind of cool to look at the big picture and compare all these different elements of measurement. And so they ended up not even collecting the data on paper, but it was just this general idea of like, okay, you're doing a slightly different investigation. We're going to compare all at the end and try to come to some conclusion, which, ties in a lot of our practices. But I really liked just the idea here, but it didn't have that great scaffolding. Like I would probably incorporate some of the other scaffolding from that parachute lab, which I made a couple years later. So yeah, there's a number of things I might tweak to support them getting towards the assessment. So the state tests should be assessing these NGSS practices, and when they are oftentimes assessing the design and conduct investigation, it's a lot of times focusing on this independent dependent variable and identifying that in there. And you can see that it starts to end up having them kind of generate and then look at the data and analyze it. So it starts to get into like the mathematical thinking and working with graphs. So it gets a little bit blurred, the lines between these two, but you can see this is an example problem where the students, they have some inputs between two different trials and they should be changing like one thing and comparing the data that they end up getting when they do that, and then using that like experiment data to answer some questions and kind of like analyze what happened. So there's a little bit of stuff where it's like, think about this and apply it, but that tends to be a little bit more of that other practice. But like just picking what your independent dependent variables are is important. And so like you can see in this question right here, they've got two things and they've kept a lot of things constant. They've changed one thing and they're observing something else to see if that responds to the change. And so you gotta have to pick independent dependent variables in the design in this context, right? So it's not saying like label IV and DV, but it's saying what's the same and what's different here. And so it's just another way of doing that, designing an experiment to try and get some data that might be useful, right? So you have to think about the data that you might be getting while you're designing this stuff. And that's really what they're getting at with these Oregon and other state tests like Washington and California I've looked at, and they've got very, very similar things. They tend to focus on these big picture practices, not the content. So focus on that with your students. So I'm going to show you the conversation with ChatGPT. The main takeaways from this is that it doesn't really understand the NGSS and like what a practice is. And so it wasn't really able to just off of the immediate request make an assessment for this SEP or for a particular standard like MSLS 1-1, which is all about one of the labs I was just showing you earlier about cells making up living things and proving that. But what's really interesting is that this ChatGPT is useful for making like criteria or categories or like splitting up information or resorting that information. And so I've got right here the practice 3 from Appendix F of the NGSS. And I was looking at this trying to make my own rubric and really struggling. And I started playing around with ChatGPT and I asked it to make a rubric for the standard. And it really struggles. Like it kept on wanting to do developing a model, because if you look at cells, and what everyone does with cells is that they're all making organelle models and drawing that out and labeling the parts. That is not the NGSS. That is not what the standard is intending. So unfortunately, ChatGPT is kind of getting a little confused here. But what was really interesting was when I told it to make an investigation that proved things are made of living things and non-living things, it actually made a pretty good lab. So it was talking here about observing onions and other stuff under a microscope, as well as salt and sugar. I wouldn't necessarily mix them in a small container. I might just take a sand sample and a pebble sample and a salt sample and put those under the microscope, which is very close to what I basically set up for my students, but I just provided the digital images for them just to kind of speed line some of this. A lot of people will be like, hey, I want my students to know how to use a microscope. I don't really care so much about that. So then this was about, okay, how about can you make some sort of expectations for someone trying to do what you just did for me there? And these were pretty good categories. A lot of this started to go into practices that are like argumentation from evidence and data analysis. Like that even says data collection and analysis. I don't want to do that when I'm focusing on this practice on designing an investigation. So I asked it to just kind of get rid of some of that stuff and just focus in on a few categories that are just for this particular practice. Like I said, hey, you're including stuff that's going into other practices. Can we try and limit it a little bit? Still kind of struggled. We're getting a little bit closer. And then this was much closer to what I liked. And then I gave it my rubric and asked for feedback, and it kind of struggled with that. But then I gave it, what was it? Yeah, I gave it a particular practice and said, hey, can you make this? And it still went back to trying to do those other practices. So I ultimately just kind of selected what I liked from here. And built something that looks kind of like this. So this is my final result. You can kind of see how it's similar to some of those other things about there being a question, some sort of planning, time, and conduction. And then these things are fairly informed by what it was including there around like independent, dependent variables, potential sources of error. Like these bullet points are very much inspired by what ChatGPT was putting down there. So I didn't fully agree with some of the categories, but the categories that it did make had some pretty nice things in there, but it wasn't able to make like a nice table quite like this. I had to kind of do that myself. But it was a good collaboration. I'm pretty happy with the result. So here's the final form of the rubric. I really like the 3-2-1 scale, and I really like these categories ultimately that we got because it doesn't really go into the other practices like 4 and 5 around data analysis and mathematical thinking, but it does have very clear criteria that you can look for scoring this. So you can see like the independent, dependent variables. If they don't have that, they're going to get marked as good if that's missing, or if they're missing that and potential sources of error, they might get marked as like weak. So that's the general idea with this, is that there's certain criteria that they have to meet. If they're missing some of them, they'll get docked down. Sometimes there's some stuff that's so off, it just brings you all the way down to the weak category. Like if you don't even follow the methods, like you write down some methods, but then you're like playing around during a lab and being kind of dangerous, well, you're going to get a weak. Like I wouldn't put absent because they were there doing the lab or doing a lab. But if they're not following the procedure, they're doing it in a not safe way, then that's going to be affecting scores, right? Because that's part of having good data is making sure people are safe. And then in addition to that, it's really important for me to highlight here that the evidence that you're collecting is their ability to do a lab, which is really hard to score in class. So I'd recommend that you record videos, and you can do this with Flipgrid. Flipgrid is really, really nice for just recording a video and having the students submit videos there just with a link. So like you could have a lab and a link, and I've got that in my handout here that I'm going to show off. So just a couple ideas as well before I go into that handout is that you could do this for example, setting up a microscope to see if they can observe and get something in focus themselves. Or it could be something like figuring out the distance that a paper clip can get picked up with by a magnet. So you can do a little investigation there, but they have to make some sort of procedure and then follow that and take a video of it so you can see their ability to do it accurately and reliably. So the actual handout it's kind of like a lab handout. This is more of a template. It's not got a lot filled in, but I do have an example I'll show you in a little bit that's a little bit more filled in. But basically, this goes by the stuff that's in that rubric. Like you should be including materials and methods. And then like, hey, maybe include this stuff in that methods section. So I've given them a little reminder of like some stuff they might want to include. This is also something that I would give to them as a digital file, not a printout. You'd have to alter it if you wanted it to be a printout thing. But I've got some instructions here for taking screenshots because for some things that might be, for some teachers, that's a nice way of showing the data collection before the lab's done, just to get evidence that it was done before the actual data was collected. And also, I mean, part of designing an investigation is being ready to collect data. So we need evidence before the data was actually collected that that table was ready. And then there's like this flip grid. I've got some like how to you can use this flip grid and just link to some flip grid for the assignment. And teachers, if you're using Flipgrid, make sure if you want the videos to be private, make sure you turn on the moderation. And then the videos that they submit to you, only you can see them. Other classmates can't see each other's procedures. And then you're not really assessing from here on out. And there's definitely some questions and analysis that you're going to want them to do. But I think that you should just be clear, like, this is not being assessed. This is not part of what I'm focusing on right now. And then I've also got the rubric at the very bottom here on this document for them so they can see that as well while they're working. So yeah, that's the basic idea of the handout. And you could assign this in like Google Classroom or something like that as a digital file. So this was honestly me just kind of playing around, seeing if chat could do this assignment essentially. So I found a PE, a performance expectation, around conducting an investigation, and basically gave that to ChatGPT and said, hey, can you do this PE? And just wanted to see like what it would make in terms of a lab write-up. And it was pretty impressive. I was actually fairly impressed by its response here. And it actually like had a better lab write-up than what I was thinking of doing with like the paper clips and the magnet. They actually have iron filings to show the magnetic fields. Pretty interesting idea for making that lab. And then it basically was like, okay, well, can you help me make a worksheet for this? Like, what could you give as instructions for students to help them get started on this? And it's pretty good. I mean, there's definitely some stuff that I like more or less with what it did there, but I ended up plugging in some of it. And you can see that that's basically the instructions here, where it's like, hey, this is what you're going to need to do. Pick something, and then make sure that you're checking your rubric before you turn it in. And I had put qualitative evidence here because that's an important element of what's going on with this particular standard. Like, qualitative is totally good enough. It doesn't need to be quantities, so it's good to clarify that. And then it's basically the exact same document from here on out where they need to be writing their investigation. Now, you could do more scaffolding and sentence frames, but that's going to depend a little bit on this prompt that you're being given. But you could definitely help them out with that. And chat could give you some options. I'm not particularly impressed by its sentence frames, but definitely a decent option. Thank you for McLearning with me. Before you go, please check out the following services that I offer with my business. So if you click the link in my videos, this goes to my website. I might be changing it from Podia because I'm no longer doing the interactive videos for sale. I might put those up for free. But most of my other services are linked here. So you can see that I've got like a Teachers Pay Teachers and a Wyzant. The Teachers Pay Teachers has a lot of my assessments that I have for like the NGSS, as well as lessons that I made when I was actually a teacher in the classroom. So I've got quite a few things like CERs and other things on there. If you want to get one-on-one live support from me, either like with science or like working on like teaching support lessons and that kind of stuff, you can sign up through Wyzant. I have a link to there where you can contact me there. And we can schedule hourly appointments. And I've got a few other things on here, like a Facebook page and other social media. And if you're interested in getting professional development with me for like a team of teachers, a whole page with information on that. So yeah, feel free to check that out. Thank you.